This video is going to be all about mastering. I'm going to show you guys exactly how I master my own music. Now, over the last couple of years, every single song that I've made, I have mastered myself, and I want to share with you a couple of my methods and techniques that I've learned over the years. So, just a quick side note before we get started. Before you go into the mastering stage, you want to make sure that you have a quality mix. So if you're having trouble with that, I have a video up on my YouTube channel where I talk about my 5 favorite mixing plugins, so maybe that might be of help to you before you go into mastering. Now, for the record, I'm no mastering engineer, but I don't believe you need one to release music professionally. I have worked with mastering engineers in the past, but I've come to realize that nobody is going to want to go the extra mile like you do for your own music. You're the person who cares most about it, and you're the only one who's going to want to stay up late to get that master over the finish line. So I think it's a very valuable skill to learn and not outsource it from the start. So without further ado, let's get right to it. So as an example, I'm going to use a mix for one of my songs called Calm Down. And as a side note, I do use some mastering plugins on my mastering chain while I am producing the song. So some people might be against this, but I do this because it gives me a better indication of how many elements I'm going to need to make my final product sound full enough. So for the sake of this video, I have left out all the mastering plugins, and this is just a rough mix down of the song. And as you can see, there's a little bit of headroom here, and you got to make sure that before you go into the mastering stage that you leave yourself with a little bit of headroom. A couple decibels is enough. Just make sure you don't come too close to that 0 decibel mark, just to avoid any clipping before we go into mastering. So let's take a listen to what this sounds like and what it might need. So usually I would start with balancing out the frequency spectrum. I think this mix sounds a little bit dull and lifeless, so I'm going to start up by opening up iZotope's Vintage EQ. So I'm going to start off by boosting some of the highs. I'm going to start with a 3K range, and I'm just going to boost it very subtly so we can just get some more clarity into that mix. I'm also going to boost a little bit around the 1.5K hertz range just to make sure we get some clarity into this mix. Now, a long time ago, I saw a video of some mastering engineer. I don't remember who it was, but he basically said that whatever your gut tells you to do that times 50%. So if you feel like you should boost the highs by 4 dB, then boost them by 2 dB. And that's because your mind is gonna focus so much on that one particular part that you're trying to alter that you're gonna overcompensate for things, and it's gonna throw things out of balance again. So just a rule of thumb, subtlety goes a long way. All right, so next up, I would probably go into compression on my mastering chain. I love to use multiple stages of compression, and the glue compressor is usually the first component of that on my mastering chain. So it's just a stock Ableton compressor, and it's actually a really good bus compressor for this. So let's see what we can do with this. So as you can see, I'm using the makeup gain to make sure that I don't lose any perceived loudness by compressing that master. And I make sure that I do that on every single plugin that I use. And that's a technique called gain staging. So you're adding a slight bit of perceived loudness with every single plugin, which is going to result in a louder master. Now, I also love to use multiband compressors on my mastering chain, and my 2 favorite compressors are the Pro MB by FabFilter and the C4 by Waves. And oftentimes I will use instances of both on my mastering chain, and that's what I'm going to do right now. And this may be somewhat controversial, but I am going to start out from preset. Just try these out. These are actually great presets, and as long as you know what's going on behind the preset, it's perfectly fine to start off from it. So as long as you make sure that you adapt the threshold and the range, and you might mess around with the attack and release and the output gain a little bit, then it's perfectly fine to use presets in my opinion. So let's see what we can do with this. Now, another reason why I like to start from one of these presets on a multiband compressor is because it's super easy to overdo it and to ruin the whole balance of your master if you start from scratch. So if you start from a preset, you keep that initial balance, and it's really easy to tweak it to whatever your master needs. So that's Pro MB. I'm gonna add another instance of C4 right now. Now, obviously, you're gonna wanna play around with that threshold, the gain, the range, attack and release maybe, of every single band to make sure that it fits your song. Now, if you're having trouble balancing out the frequency spectrum of your songs, it might be useful to use other similar songs as a reference to make sure that you keep your balance in check. Now, over time, if you like your mastering, it's very useful to start referencing against your own masters, because then you keep your mastering sound consistent across your whole catalog. All right, next up, I'm going to be using some sort of imaging plugin, and I'm going to be using the iZotope Ozones imager right now. The main thing that I'm doing here is just making sure that everything below around 100 hertz is summed to mono. So I'm just going to make this 100% mono. I might mess around with different frequency bands, but I'm usually very, very subtle with this because most of the stereo shaping should be done in the mix already. So I'm just going to leave it at this for now. Now, as some last resort, I sometimes go to iZotope Ozones Exciter, and this is basically a multiband saturation plugin, but I think it's a very useful tool when your highs don't shine as bright as you would want them to. So you can just add a frequency band like this, and you have different saturation modes over here. They all sound really good. I really like the retro mode. It's kind of aggressive, but it gives a really nice shine to those highs. So I'm just gonna use that a tiny bit. So I think that's about right. Now, last but not least, we're going to go into loudness, and this has been somewhat of a controversial item over the last couple of years, but I believe we're completely out of the loudness war right now, so I just master to where the song sits comfortably, and I don't just master for loudness. Now, I highly recommend you use some kind of tool to measure your loudness, and I'm using iZotope's Insight for this example. So how this works is you have the LUFS, which is perceived loudness units. You have a short-term integrated loudness and momentary loudness. We're going to focus on integrated loudness, which is the average loudness of your whole track. You have the momentary loudness, obviously, and you have the short-term, which is just the last couple seconds average. So another thing you want to keep your eye on is true peak. Ideally, you don't want to go over 0 dB true peak. As a point of reference, Spotify turns everything down to -14 LUFS, which is pretty quiet, and I'm usually at about -9 LUFS. Sometimes I would even go to -11 if it's a very, very dynamic, more acoustic track. So that's really not that loud. So let's take a look at where the song sits right now in terms of loudness. So we're at about -14 LUFS, which is pretty quiet. I'm going to add in a limiter. I'm going to be using the L1 by Waves. I sometimes use the Pro L by FabFilter, which is a great limiter as well. I'm just going to be using the L1 for now. I'm just going to pull that threshold down until I think it hits a sweet spot. Whenever you hear something distorting or clipping, that means you've gone too far, so you want to turn it back down a little bit. So another thing you want to keep an eye on is the ceiling over here. Ideally, you want to set a value of about -0.3 dB or 0.4, 0.5 maximum. That's plenty. And this is going to make sure there's no inner sample peaking. So those are weird artifacts that are going on when your signal is running too hot against that 0 dB mark. So let's refresh this and take a look at where we are at right now in terms of loudness.
Is the high with the pain of the calm down? Every time I come down, got so high, flying too close to the sun now, playing we don't burn out.
So we're running against that -9 LUFS area. We went a tiny bit over that true peak of 0 dB, which is fine. Just make sure you're not running over it constantly. I'm just gonna keep it at this for the sake of this video. Now let's take a look at the before and after. So this is without mastering.
Is the high with the pain of the calm down? Every time I come down.
And this is with mastering.
Is the high with the pain of the calm down? Every time I come down.
So it immediately brightens up the sound, it opens it up, and it glues everything together into a more consistent master. So this is pretty much my mastering chain. I would sometimes use more specific plugins whenever there are specific issues in the song that need to be fixed in the mastering stage, but these are most of the staples that return in almost every single one of my mastering chains on my songs. All right, that was it for my mastering tips and tricks. I hope it could help some of you out. I'm planning on sharing literally everything that I know about music production, writing, and recording, so if you have any questions or video requests, make sure to leave them in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.